Before sunrise, the Alpha King's 2 precious cubs vanished without a trace. Hundreds of wolves searched the frozen forest, following tiny paw prints through the snow, until one guard heard a faint whimper coming from an abandoned cottage. Inside, the missing royal cubs were alive, warm, safe, and peacefully asleep against the chest of a poor Omega girl who had nothing to her name. But when Alpha King Kaelen stepped through the door and saw his children wrapped in her arms, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The cubs weren't afraid of her. They had chosen her. Before sunrise, the royal nursery of Frostvale was already empty. Snow pressed softly against the tall windows of the northern tower, turning the world outside into a pale blur of white and silver. The fire in the nursery hearth had burned low during the night, leaving only a bed of red coals beneath the ash. 2 small beds stood beneath the carved beams, their blankets thrown back as if the children had risen only moments before. But they had not risen. They were gone. The first person to discover it was an old nurse carrying a tray of warm milk. She stopped in the doorway so suddenly that the cups rattled against one another. For several seconds, she simply stared. Then the tray slipped from her hands. Clay shattered across the stone floor. A cry tore through the fortress. Within minutes, Frostvale was awake. Guards thundered through the corridors. Doors opened. Servants ran barefoot across cold floors. Bells rang from the eastern tower, their deep notes rolling across the mountain slopes and waking wolves in the lower kennels. King Kaelen arrived without a cloak. He had been sleeping in the western chamber when the alarm reached him, and he had crossed half the fortress before anyone could stop him. His dark hair was still damp from sleep, and his boots struck the stone hard enough to echo. He entered the nursery and froze. His children were gone. Lyra's little wooden wolf lay on the floor beneath the window. Rowan's blue blanket had been pulled halfway across the room. Kaelen walked toward the beds. Slowly, he touched the empty pillow where his daughter's head had rested only hours earlier. His fingers remained there for a moment. Then his eyes moved to the window. The latch was broken. Fresh snow had blown across the sill. And below it, on the white ground outside, were 2 sets of tiny paw prints. Kaelen's jaw tightened. "Seal the gates." His voice was quiet. That frightened the guards more than shouting would have. "Nobody leaves Frostvale. Search every room, every stable, every tunnel." The fortress exploded into motion. Hunters saddled horses. Wolves were released from their kennels. Torches were carried into the forest despite the fading darkness. Soldiers spread across the mountain paths, following the little tracks that disappeared between the pines. Kaelen followed them himself. He did not care that the snow soaked through his boots. He did not care that the wind cut his face. He only saw 2 things in his mind. Lyra's smile. Rowan's small hand wrapped around his finger. They were the only pieces of his wife that still lived in this world. And he had already failed their mother once. He would not fail them too. Far beyond the fortress, where the royal hunters had not yet reached, the forest grew wild. Pines crowded the slopes so tightly that even daylight struggled to reach the ground. Snow rested heavily upon their branches, and every few moments a clump fell with a soft, muffled thump. Beneath one of those trees, something moved. Elara heard it before she saw it. A tiny whimper. She stopped walking. The basket hanging from her arm swung gently against her hip. She had spent the morning gathering winterroot, and the bitter cold had already numbed her fingers. Her old wool coat was patched at both elbows, and one boot had a crack across the leather. She listened. There it was again. A faint sound. Almost too soft to hear beneath the wind. Elara placed her basket in the snow. Then she followed the sound. She pushed through a curtain of low branches and found 2 small shapes curled beneath a fallen pine. Her breath caught. Wolf cubs. They were too young to be alone. The smaller one had snow caught in its fur. The other was trembling so violently that its little body seemed to shake with every breath. Elara crouched. "Easy." She slowly removed her coat. The cubs tried to retreat, but they had nowhere to go. Elara stopped moving. She waited. The wind whispered through the trees. A few flakes landed on her dark hair. Then she stretched one hand toward them. The smaller cub sniffed her fingers. Elara's heart broke. They were freezing. She lifted them both into her arms. The heavier cub pressed its face beneath her chin. The smaller one made a weak sound and tucked its paws against her chest. Elara pulled the coat around them. Only then did she notice the faint silver thread woven through their fur. She frowned. There was something unusual about these cubs. Something she did not yet understand. Then, far away through the trees, she heard horns. Royal horns. Elara looked toward the sound. Her face changed. The whole kingdom knew what those horns meant. The Alpha King's children were missing. She looked down at the two cubs in her arms. Then toward the distant fortress. Fear tightened her stomach. If these were the missing royal cubs, the law was clear. An outsider who touched royal blood without permission could be imprisoned. And an Omega with no family, no rank, and no protector had very little chance of surviving royal judgment. Another horn sounded. Closer this time. Elara hugged the cubs tighter. Then she turned away from the fortress. Not because she wanted to steal them. Not because she wanted anything from the crown. She simply could not leave two freezing children beneath a tree. So she carried them deeper into the forest. Toward the little cottage nobody visited anymore. Behind her, unseen through the trees, 3 royal wolves entered the clearing. Their noses lowered to the snow. They found the same scent Elara had left behind. And they began to follow. Elara's cottage stood at the edge of an old clearing where the forest became too steep for horses. It had once belonged to a family of herbalists, but years of harsh winters had emptied the place. The roof sagged over one side, the shutters hung crooked, and moss covered the stones around the chimney. To Elara, it was still home. She pushed the door open with her shoulder. Inside, the room was dark. She placed the cubs on the narrow bed and immediately began gathering wood. There was not much. 3 small pieces. That was all. She stared at them. Then at the cubs. She broke the largest piece in half. The fire came alive slowly. Orange light crawled across the walls. Elara wrapped the cubs in every blanket she owned. One was thin enough to see through, and the other smelled faintly of dried lavender, but together they made a small nest of warmth. The cubs remained restless. Elara touched the smaller one's ears. Cold. Far too cold. She hurried to the cupboard. 1 loaf of bread. A handful of dried berries. A little water. Nothing else. She stared at the bread. She had been saving it for tomorrow. Tomorrow suddenly did not matter. She broke the loaf into pieces. The cubs were too weak to eat much, so Elara softened the bread with warm water and offered it carefully. The smaller cub licked her palm. She smiled despite herself. There you are. The larger cub rested its head on her knee. For the first time that morning, Elara allowed herself to breathe. She had always been told that Omegas were weak. That they needed stronger wolves to protect them. That they belonged at the bottom of the pack. Her own village had taught her that lesson cruelly. When her parents died, the village council had decided she was no longer worth supporting. She had been given 1 winter cloak and sent away with nothing but a small herb knife. She had expected to die. Instead, the forest had become her family. She learned which roots could heal fever. Which leaves stopped bleeding. Which berries were poisonous. Which animals would approach a quiet hand. She had never possessed power. But she had learned how to keep fragile things alive. The larger cub shifted. Elara lifted it carefully. Its fur was soft beneath her fingers. Then she saw something beneath the damp fur on its chest. A silver crescent. Her smile disappeared. She pulled the smaller cub closer. The same mark. A royal mark. Every child in Frostvale knew the symbol. The silver crescent belonged to the bloodline of the Alpha King. Elara stared at the 2 cubs. Oh! The word barely escaped her lips. Outside, something moved. She turned. Silence. Then came a distant howl. The cubs raised their heads. Elara went to the window. Through the trees, she saw shadows moving between the trunks. Wolves. Royal wolves. Her heart began beating faster. She could return the cubs. She knew that. She should return them. But then she looked at their tiny bodies. They had been poisoned. She did not know that yet. She only knew they were sick. and something inside her told her that taking them back immediately might be dangerous. So she stayed. She placed the cubs against her chest and sat beside the fire. Their breathing slowly became calmer. The smaller one tucked its nose beneath her chin. The larger one curled against her ribs. Elara's eyes closed. For a few minutes, the forest disappeared. There was only warmth, breathing, 2 tiny heartbeats, and the faint crackle of burning wood. At the fortress, Kaelen was no longer searching like a king. He was searching like a father. His horse climbed the frozen trail while 6 wolves ran beside him. Every hour that passed made the cold feel sharper. Every empty trail made the fear inside him worse. A scout rode toward him. "Your Majesty." Kaelen stopped. The scout dismounted. "We found another trail." "Where?" "Northwest." Kaelen looked toward the mountains. The scout hesitated. "It belongs to a woman." Kaelen's eyes narrowed. "What woman?" "We don't know. An Omega, perhaps. Her footprints lead toward the old herbalist's cottage." Kaelen stared into the forest. For the first time since the search began, something resembling hope entered his eyes. Then it vanished beneath suspicion. Someone had taken his children. Someone had carried them into the forest. He would find that person. And if they had harmed even one hair on his children's heads, no law in Frostvale would save them. Meanwhile, Elara woke to the sound of scratching. One of the cubs was awake. It had crawled toward the door. Elara followed. The cub pressed its nose against a gap beneath the wooden frame. Outside, something breathed. Slowly, deeply. Elara reached for her herb knife. The cub turned around. Instead of growling, it walked back to her. Then it pressed itself against her ankle. Elara looked toward the door. A shadow passed beneath it. Then disappeared. She held her breath. The next sound was a distant wolf howl. Not threatening. Searching. Elara lowered her knife. She understood then. The royal pack was close. And soon, so would the king. By late afternoon, snow had begun falling heavily. Kaelen reached the old cottage just before darkness. He dismounted. The royal wolves stopped beside him. All of them raised their noses. One gave a low growl. Kaelen lifted his hand. Silence. The cottage stood ahead beneath heavy pine branches. Smoke rose from its crooked chimney. Someone was inside. Kaelen walked forward. His boots sank into the snow. He reached the door. Then stopped. He could hear something. A faint whimper. His chest tightened. He pushed the door open. Warm air touched his face. The cottage was small. Poor. Barely furnished. A fire burned in the hearth. And beside it sat a young woman. She was asleep. Her head rested against the wall. Her arms were wrapped around 2 wolf cubs. Kaelen could not move. Lyra was curled beneath the woman's chin. Rowan lay across her chest. Both were alive. Both were sleeping. Their tiny bodies rose and fell with hers. The king stared. For a moment, everything he had prepared to say vanished. The cubs had refused every nurse since their mother's death. They cried whenever strangers tried to hold them. They had even bitten royal guards. Yet here they were. Peaceful. Safe. Home. Kaelen stepped closer. Elara woke. Her eyes opened slowly. Then she saw him. She immediately sat upright. The cubs stirred. Elara's arms tightened around them. Kaelen's voice was low. "Those children belong to me." Elara swallowed. "I know." "Then why are they here?" She looked down at the cubs. They were freezing. Kaelen's expression hardened. "You should have brought them back." "I was afraid." The king stared at her. "Of what?" Elara's fingers moved gently through the smaller cub's fur. "That they would die before I reached the castle." Before Kaelen could answer, the door opened again. Lord Varrek entered with 4 guards. He was tall, thin, and dressed in black fur trimmed with silver. His face carried the calm expression of a man who enjoyed having authority. His eyes went immediately to Elara. Then to the cubs. His expression changed. "She has enchanted them." Elara looked up. Kaelen turned sharply. What? Varrek stepped closer. Omega magic. There are old practices used to bind young wolves through scent and touch. Elara's face went pale. I did nothing. Of course you would say that. Kaelen looked at the cubs. Varrek continued. The law allows us to detain her. Kaelen's jaw tightened. He wanted to refuse. But he had learned long ago that a king could not rule on instinct alone. Take her to the fortress. Elara's arms tightened around the cubs. No. The word surprised everyone. Varrek smiled. She resists the king. Kaelen looked at her. Elara's voice shook. I will go. But let me carry them. Varrek stepped forward. Give the children to the guards. The larger cub suddenly growled. It was a tiny sound. Barely more than a rumble. But the guard nearest Elara stepped back. The smaller cub buried its face against her. Kaelen watched carefully. Let her carry them. Varrek's smile faded. They returned to the fortress before midnight. Elara was placed in a quiet chamber instead of a prison cell. The cubs remained with her. Kaelen told himself it was temporary. He told himself he was protecting his children. But every time he passed the chamber, he heard their soft breathing. And something inside him refused to believe Varrek's accusation. Then the court healer came to him. Her face was white. My king. Kaelen turned. What is it? The healer held a small silver bowl. Inside was a dark residue taken from the cub's blood. They were poisoned. Kaelen stopped breathing. The healer continued quietly. Not enough to kill them immediately. Whoever did it wanted them weak. Kaelen's eyes hardened. How long? Several days. He looked toward the chamber. How are they alive? The healer hesitated. We don't know. Kaelen's voice became colder. Find out. The healer lowered her eyes. There is something else. She showed him a small bundle of crushed leaves. These herbs were found in the cubs' stomachs. Kaelen recognized them. He had seen them growing near the cottage. Who gave them this? The healer looked toward Elara's chamber. The Omega. Kaelen stood completely still. The woman he had suspected of taking his children had been keeping them alive. Then, from behind the chamber door, came a tiny sound. A cub crying. Kaelen moved toward it. But before he could enter, Lord Varrek appeared at the end of the corridor. And for the briefest moment, something flickered across the advisor's face. Fear. The next morning, frost covered the fortress windows. Kaelen stood alone in the great hall while the kingdom woke around him. He had slept for less than an hour. The healer's words remained inside his mind. The poison had been administered over several days. That meant someone inside the fortress had access to his children. Someone trusted. Someone close. Kaelen could not accuse Varrek without proof. The advisor had served his family for 15 years. He had stood beside the king when the queen died. He had helped govern Frostvale through 2 terrible winters. But Kaelen remembered something now. Varrek had been the person who insisted the children remain inside the fortress after their mother's death. He had controlled the nursery. He had chosen the nurses. He had approved the food. Kaelen's hands curled slowly into fists. He needed evidence. And until he found it, he would pretend nothing had changed. So he ordered Elara watched. He ordered the cubs watched. And publicly, he allowed the court to believe that he still suspected her. Inside her chamber, Elara sat beside the window. The cubs slept in her lap. She had been given clean clothing, warm food, and a proper bed, yet she still felt like a prisoner. She missed the forest. The wind through the trees. The smell of pine. The quiet. But when Lyra woke and placed one paw against her wrist, Elara smiled. You found me again. The cub blinked sleepily. Rowan crawled into her lap. Elara laughed softly. It was the first real laugh heard inside that chamber in many months. A servant standing nearby smiled before quickly looking away. The change was small. But it spread. The servants began leaving extra blankets. A cook sent warm milk. A stable boy brought fresh apples. The fortress, which had felt like a tomb since the queen's death, began to breathe again. Kaelen noticed. He did not say anything. One evening, he stood outside the chamber and watched through the half-open door. Elara sat on the floor beside the fire. Lyra slept against her shoulder. Rowan had fallen asleep in her lap. Elara was mending the torn edge of a blanket. Kaelen had seen his children surrounded by gold, silk, toys, servants, but never peace. He remained there longer than he intended. Then he walked away. He did not see the shadow watching him from the opposite corridor. Varrek. The advisor understood what was happening. The Omega was becoming important. Not only to the cubs. To the king. That could not be allowed. 3 nights later, Varrek acted. A forged message was delivered to Elara. It claimed that the king had ordered the cubs moved to a safe shelter outside the fortress. Elara believed it. She wrapped both children in thick cloaks. Then she followed the messenger through a servant's passage. The moment she entered the forest, the trap closed. Arrows struck the trees around her. She spun. The messenger was gone. Men stepped from the darkness. Elara pulled the cubs against her. One guard shouted that she had attempted to flee with the royal children. She understood too late. The trap had been designed perfectly. By dawn, she was back in the fortress. This time, Kaelen was waiting. The cubs were taken from her. They cried. Elara reached toward them. Please. Kaelen's face was stone. Why did you run? I didn't. There were witnesses. They lied. Varrek stood behind him. The evidence is clear. Kaelen looked at Elara. He wanted to believe her. But every piece of evidence had been placed exactly where he could see it. The forged message. The forest guards. The footprints. His children outside the fortress. His heart battled his judgment. And judgment won. Elara of the northern forest, he said, his voice low, you are sentenced to death for attempting to steal royal blood. The words seemed to empty the room. Elara stared at him. She did not cry. That somehow made it worse. The guards took her away. Hours later, she stood in the execution courtyard beneath a grey sky. The blade waited. The cubs were held inside the fortress. Then suddenly, Lyra screamed. The sound travelled through the stone corridors. Kaelen turned. The cub had escaped. Guards chased her through the hall. But instead of running toward the courtyard, Lyra raced down a narrow passage. Kaelen followed. The cub stopped before an old stone wall. She scratched at it. Kaelen looked down. A draft touched his face. Cold air. From behind the wall. He moved a hidden lever. Stone shifted. A doorway opened. Beyond it was a staircase descending into darkness. Kaelen's eyes narrowed. Someone had been using a forgotten tunnel beneath his fortress. He took a torch. Then he heard voices below. Varrek's voice. Tonight, the children die. Kaelen's blood went cold. The truth had finally revealed itself. And he was already too late. Kaelen ran. His boots struck the stone steps as he descended into the darkness. Lyra raced ahead. Her claws clicked against the floor. Behind them, 2 royal guards followed with drawn swords. The tunnel smelled of damp earth and old smoke. Water dripped from the ceiling. The deeper they went, the warmer the air became. Then came voices. Varrek. And several others. Kaelen reached the bottom. The tunnel opened into a chamber beneath the fortress. Torches burned along the walls. Barrels were stacked in the corners. Maps covered a wooden table. And in the center of the room stood Rowan and Lyra. A man held each cub. Varrek turned. For the first time, his calm mask disappeared. The king stepped from the shadows. Release my children. Varrek smiled. You were always slower than I expected. Kaelen drew his sword. You poisoned them. I did. The words struck like ice. Kaelen's eyes narrowed. Why? Because your bloodline ends with them. Varrek gestured toward the maps. For years, I have waited. Your wife died believing the court was loyal. She never knew the poison was meant for her first. Kaelen's face changed. The queen. The memory hit him with terrible force. Her final winter. Her weakness. The healer who had claimed it was an illness. Varrek continued. After you died fighting the northern clans, the kingdom would have fallen into my hands. But you survived. Then the children were born. Kaelen stepped forward. You murdered their mother. Varrek smiled. And soon, I will remove the last obstacle. The guards attacked. Steel rang against steel. The chamber erupted. Kaelen moved with brutal precision. One man fell. Another staggered backward. But Varrek had planned for this. The tunnel behind them began to collapse. Explosives hidden in the stone exploded with a deafening roar. Dust filled the chamber. Rock crashed from the ceiling. Kaelen grabbed Lyra. A guard seized Rowan. And somewhere above them, Elara heard the explosion. She had not been executed. The executioner had refused to carry out the sentence when the fortress shook, buying enough time for the truth to emerge. Elara ran. She did not know where she was going. She only followed the sound. She found the hidden doorway. Then she descended. Smoke filled the tunnel. Kaelen. Her voice disappeared into the noise. She heard a cry. A cub. She kept moving. A stone fell beside her. She flinched. Then she saw Varrek. He was dragging Rowan toward another passage. Elara stepped between them. She had no sword. No armor. No guard. Only her hands. Varrek laughed. Move. Elara did not. The cub trembled behind her. Her knees shook. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it. But she remained standing. Move. She shook her head. Then something changed in the darkness. A growl. Deep. Powerful. Kaelen emerged through the smoke. Blood ran down one side of his face. His sword was still in his hand. Varrek turned. The fight lasted seconds. Kaelen struck Varrek's sword away. The advisor fell. Guards seized him. The tunnel groaned again. Everyone out. Kaelen grabbed the children. Elara followed. Then the ceiling collapsed. Stone crashed between them. Elara disappeared. Kaelen turned. Elara. Nothing. He dropped the cubs into the arms of a guard and began tearing at the rubble with his bare hands. Stone cut his palms. Blood covered his fingers. The guards tried to help. He pushed them away. Move. A faint sound came from beneath the rocks. Kaelen froze. Again. They dug. One stone. Then another. Finally, they found her. Elara was trapped beneath a fallen beam. Her eyes were closed. Kaelen lifted the beam with both hands. The guards pulled her free. She was barely breathing. Kaelen gathered her into his arms. For one terrifying moment, she did not move. Then her fingers curled weakly against his chest. He lowered his head. Stay with me. Her eyes opened slightly. She looked past him. Ah, they safe. Kaelen looked toward the cubs. They were alive. He carried Elara out. The fortress above them was filling with smoke. Snow began falling through the broken ceiling. Outside, wolves gathered on the mountain slopes, howling into the night. For the first time in years, Kaelen felt something other than fear. He felt gratitude. And beneath it, something deeper. Something he was not yet ready to name. Elara woke 3 days later. The first thing she saw was firelight. The second was Lyra asleep beside her. Rowan lay curled against her other arm. And Kaelen stood near the window. When he heard her breathe, he turned. Elara looked at him. He crossed the room. I owe you my life. She shook her head. No. Kaelen looked at the children. You saved my family. Elara smiled faintly. They needed someone. Kaelen's eyes lowered. They still do. Elara did not understand what he meant. Not yet. Spring came slowly to Frostvale. The snow melted first around the southern walls. Then along the forest paths. Small streams appeared beneath the ice, running silver between stones that had been buried all winter. The kingdom learned the truth about Lord Varrek. He had poisoned the queen. He had poisoned the royal cubs. He had planned to murder the children and seize the throne. The evidence was undeniable. Varrek was stripped of his title and imprisoned. The guards who had served him were judged according to their crimes. And the name Elara, once spoken with suspicion, became spoken with respect. But Elara did not want statues. She did not want jewels. She did not want a place in the court. She wanted trees. Quiet. Animals. A little fire. A roof that did not leak. Kaelen understood. So he gave her a house at the edge of the royal forest. It was larger than her old cottage but still simple. A stone fireplace. Wide windows. A small herb garden. A stable. And a fenced clearing where injured wolves could recover safely. The first morning she moved in, Lyra ran through the doorway before anyone could stop her. Rowan followed. They raced across the floor. Elara laughed. Kaelen stood outside. For a moment, he simply watched. The children were happy. Not pretending. Not smiling because servants told them to. Happy. They climbed onto Elara's lap. She wrapped her arms around them. The king looked away. He did not want anyone to see what the sight did to him. Later that evening, Kaelen returned alone. Elara was sitting outside beside the herb garden. The sun was disappearing behind the mountains. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." She smiled. There was no fear in her eyes anymore. No uncertainty. Only trust. Kaelen sat beside her. For a while, neither spoke. The forest filled the silence. Birds settling into branches. Wind moving through pine needles. A distant wolf calling from the hills. Kaelen looked toward the house. "I spent years believing I had to protect my children by building walls around them." Elara watched the sunset. Sometimes walls keep people safe. And sometimes they keep them lonely. She looked at him. He smiled faintly. It was the first time she had seen him smile without pain behind it. The months passed. Kaelen visited often. Sometimes as king. Sometimes as a father. Sometimes simply as a man who had discovered he did not want to eat dinner alone anymore. Nothing happened quickly. There was no sudden promise. No grand declaration. Trust grew in smaller ways. A cup of tea left beside his chair. A blanket placed over Elara's shoulders when the evening turned cold. A book left on the table because Kaelen remembered she liked old forest legends. A hand resting beside another on the porch. A quiet smile. And every morning, the cubs ran from the fortress to Elara's home. They always found her. They always climbed into her arms. And eventually, the kingdom stopped calling her the Omega Girl. They called her family. Years later, people would tell the story differently. Some said the royal cubs had vanished because of an ancient prophecy. Others claimed the forest wolves had chosen Elara. Children in Frostvale whispered that the moon itself had guided her to the hidden clearing. But Elara knew the truth. There had been no prophecy. No magic. No destiny written in the stars. There had only been 2 freezing children beneath a tree. And one woman who could not walk away. One winter evening, long after the danger had passed, Elara sat beside the fire. Snow fell outside. Lyra slept against her chest. Rowan was curled beside her, one tiny paw resting over Elara's hand. Kaelen stood in the doorway. He watched them silently. The firelight touched Elara's face. She looked peaceful. Safe. At home. Kaelen remembered the first time he had seen her. A frightened Omega in a broken cottage. A woman he had believed might have stolen his children. Now he understood. She had never stolen anything. She had given his children the one thing the palace could not. A place where they felt safe enough to sleep. Elara looked up. Their eyes met. She smiled. Kaelen stepped inside and closed the door against the cold. Outside, wolves gathered beneath the moon. Their white breath rose into the night. They did not howl for war. They did not howl for danger. They howled softly, one after another, until the sound rolled through the forest like a song. Frostvale had once been a kingdom built around a throne. Then it became a kingdom built around a family. And that family had begun with 2 lost cubs, a lonely Omega, and a simple act of kindness that no law, no title, and no crown could ever command. Elara looked down at the sleeping children. Their breathing was slow. Peaceful. Safe. Kaelen sat beside her. He placed his hand gently over hers. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Beyond the windows, snow covered the old paths where fear had once followed them. The forest stood quiet beneath the stars. And for the first time since the Queen's death, the Alpha King no longer felt as though he was guarding the last pieces of a broken family. He was home. The children were home. And the woman everyone had once considered powerless had become the heart of the kingdom. The wolves knew it before anyone else did. That was why, beneath the winter moon, they gathered around the little house in the forest. Not to guard a king. Not to defend a throne. But to protect the home they had chosen.